Alright, in this video we're going to jump in and speak about Destiny 2 as a live game right now. Of course, most of that revolves around Call to Arms, where Bungie have been back and forth with a few changes. In an attempt to improve this event, of course one of the big issues being this whole thing about scoring, they've made more changes in the past few days which we'll touch on. There are plenty of reports though that this has actually made it worse for max power players, so we will touch on that briefly. We'll also speak about the pipeline of events that Bungie have planned over the next few months. Some important things about how they can improve this. There's a bunch of community feedback that Bungie have responded to, so we'll touch on some of those, and how a lot of the problems in Call to Arms actually relate to Destiny 2's bigger loot issue at the moment. So it is a bit of a mixed bag here. We'll additionally speak about the end of Call to Arms, where we're getting something called Celebration Week, which appears to have a handful of benefits in itself, and Bungie haven't specifically kind of outlined those yet. So we'll get into it, guys. If you enjoy the video, a rating really does help me out on the channel. Otherwise, let's go. So going back to the start of Call to Arms, on day one, I'll admit I did complain about point allocation based on power level, and this was a widespread piece of feedback, my initial thing right here. When I was at something like 480 power, I played with a friend at 550 power. We performed basically the same in the activity, but they got 50 points and I got 5 points, which was not ideal. There were a lot of people who said, why aren't you max power? And you'd occasionally get the argument that max power players should have the advantage, which I'll be honest, I completely disagree with that. I don't disagree with there being advantages to being maximum power, and players who do that should absolutely be rewarded, but anyway, Bungie obviously agreed with this, generally speaking. And a few days ago, they tuned scoring so that lower power players got a boost for the Call to Arms score to offset the impact of power. They said we expect this to mitigate most, but not all of the advantage that power currently conveys, and this should broaden the competition by elevating players who quickly complete activities with difficult modifiers, while still giving high power players an edge. They also know that for players under 550 power, be aware that the Call to Arms score won't match the Portal reward score, so they've basically got some other kind of scoring system going on in the background, trying to compensate for the original issue with power. Fast forward to that update though, and it turns out at this point that if you're 550 power, it appears you're actually scoring slightly fewer points than if you're at a lower power level. I assume this is because of the boost and whatever it's doing, not being 100% accurate. So this has been reported on by a few folks, but Rage posted, as seen below in the first clip, a 546 power Guardian with a slower time is getting 3.466 million points versus a 550 power Guardian with a 10-second faster time only able to achieve 3.4. And there were other reports that are pretty similar. There's also, we should keep in mind, a bit of variation in these activity runs, you know, whether you get a high value target spawn. And on salt mines, it sometimes seems like you'll clear out the room and have to wait ages for ads to spawn, and on another run that won't happen. So there's one piece of feedback for future events like this, for Bungie to kind of normalize the behavior of the activities and reduce the amount of RNG. And I'd say at the moment, the current scoring disadvantage for max power players is nowhere near as stark as it was on day one, you know, if you are below max power. It's a much smaller percentile, you're talking 1 or 2% difference in the score, but I do recognize that's frustrating if you want to get, you know, the absolute maximum highest scores possible, if you're being an absolute event sweat. So this has exposed a number of issues with Call to Arms that actually connect to Destiny's loot system in general. DMG has said he's watching feedback on one of the master threads for focus feedback on the Destiny Reddit. And while not everyone will agree, I've seen a bunch of players say a similar thing to what I have. Horse posted, it's simple really, scoring in the event should have been based on skill, but the power system meant that only certain players had access to the ability to score high. Like literally every other problem in the game right now though, this can be solved by eliminating the power grind altogether. And they go on to say that nothing will fix what's broken until the artificial gatekeeping of the power grind is eliminated. So whether you agree or not with the current sentiment around actual scoring, I do think there's a lot of truth in that. And we saw this going back, you know, like the whole tier 5 thing. I've always argued that tier 5 loot, tier 4 and 5 loot should be based on the difficulty of the activity content and not just your power level. This isn't the same thing as me saying players shouldn't be rewarded for reaching max power or very high power levels, but if Bungie are going to keep a system similar to this in the future, I think there should be a lot more focus on challenge and incentivizing that challenge, right? Whether you're a solo player, whether you're playing in teams. Power shouldn't be the only thing that's dictating your rewards, and it applies to Call to Arms as well, which is why I always argued that being able to get, you know, the maximum possible score shouldn't be reserved for players who are at max power. It just doesn't make sense for a competitive event, right? It's the same way as when you go into trials at the weekend, if you go into trials at the weekend, maybe you don't, but if Bungie were to say it's impossible to go flawless unless you're 550 power, everyone would be like, that's bonkers. So what's the difference with another competitive event for PvE, right? There's additional feedback that kind of mirrors what I was saying about the activities being consistent in terms of scoring. It's difficult for it to be a competitive event when there's a lot of RNG in how the activities will actually play out, whether you get a high value target and things like that. Bungie should be taking this feedback on board because they've already announced a slew of different live events for the game. So of course, dawning in December, Arms Week coming back in January, Guardian Games in March, the yearly class competition. So there's one to think about ahead of time. If there's going to be a competitive component of it, totally decouple it from this power portal scoring business. Otherwise, we'll probably end up seeing a similar issue with it, right? Call to Arms is set to return, however, in mid-season, and this is Season of the Lawless after Renegades, so that will be around April. I've seen speculation as to whether that means maybe we don't get another expansion until 4 months after that. Who knows at this point? Even if we were getting an expansion in June, April would probably still be considered mid-season, albeit the back end of the middle of the season. Not that that expansion date is confirmed. Iron Banner will also return, as well as Heavy Metal. And yes, it doesn't appear that we're getting Iron Banner back before the end of this season. One of the reasons for that is that Call to Arms runs for another week now, then next week will be the final week before Renegades, but while the scoring component of Call to Arms will have concluded, we'll still see Devrim Kay in the tower, so the event kind of continues. And there's a quest here called The Last Hurrah. The Call to Arms event has ended, but Celebration Week has just begun. Speak with Devrim in the tower to learn more about Celebration Week. And this is basically the point where we get our rewards for Call to Arms based on however we've scored. So you've earned some prestigious awards, open the chest beside Devrim to claim them, and then speak with Devrim again to learn about the remaining benefits of Celebration Week. So we don't know exactly what these will be, whether it's just the continuation of the boosted general activity rewards for Call to Arms, or whether there might be something else thrown in the mix, but that's a different part of this event that we'll get next week at the reset. I would, however, say though, it confirms that we're not going to get Iron Banner in the final week because Saladin and Devrim Kay stand in the same place in the tower. That probably sounds like an insane justification for why we wouldn't get Iron Banner, but I think it's actually probably true. It's one of the reasons. It may also be that Bungie extended Festival of the Lost, right? They could have perhaps squeezed an Iron Banner in between the two other end of season events and then, yeah, we'd have got it. I think Bungie should have Iron Banner a bit more frequently as we move into next year. But ultimately, the point of this video, as well as to give some news updates regarding Call to Arms, is to hammer home how much this kind of portal scoring system, which includes the tier system and power, actually has a negative impact on the game, and it's overly convoluted. The same way that I think the modifier and the difficulty system right now is a bit all over the place. I genuinely miss the days where we just had a normal mode and a hard mode, maybe a Grandmaster mode. Everybody knew where they stood, everybody knew what rewards they would get, and it was also nice being able to go into something technically very under-leveled, conquer it, and still be rewarded for the actual achievement of having done it, right? And that applies to Call to Arms right here as well, especially given that Bungie wanted to bring players back on board. It's an end of season event with a big catch-up component. One of the absolute wins for Call to Arms as it currently stands is that it's really rewarding, right? There's lots of drops. That's on top of the free chest that Zavala had. You know, if you're coming back to the game before Renegades, it is really easy to level up, but they kind of slipped on the scoring and the competitive part of Call to Arms, which is a shame. So for future iterations, and the same applies to Guardian Games, which should totally have a dedicated scoring mechanic that is not impacted by power. And for those who'd say power should be rewarded, I definitely agree with that, but I don't think the entire reward system of the game and investment for every single player should be impacted by it, right? That's why Bungie could have perhaps had more players come back to the game for Call to Arms if this wasn't, you know, the way it was working. I don't know. So that's kind of my feedback on it. And for those who've also asked me, why are you not 550 power? Well, if we go back a month or two ago, I remember saying in a video that I'd kind of reached the threshold where I could get tier 5 loot. And for me in particular, given the amount of grind that it actually was initially to get to that level, especially because I did most of this grind before they buffed power, I wasn't really in the mood to just grind up to a number for no known reason, right? If I'd have known that Call to Arms was going to drop and require a max power level, it probably would have incentivized me. There's another communication problem from Bungie. They didn't tell anyone that that would be the case before the event started. So, as others have said, even with a bit of sarcasm, at least there is a lot of learning opportunity here for Bungie. Throughout all of this season, the power stuff, the tier stuff, the portal stuff, the event thing, while I appreciate it will take time to fix, I don't think the solution is that complicated. I think we've already had systems in Destiny that have done a pretty good job without us needing to go down this road, right? So that's my 2 cents. There's the little bit of news, I suppose. Here's a bit of memery from Destiny the game. D2's been nominated for the Monetization Mastery Award. Wow! I'd like to point out this is a fake award, with the Game Awards coming up shortly. I guess they just wanted to have a bit of a laugh with it. I actually think Destiny 2 is far from the worst in terms of monetization. Not that I'm sticking up for Bungie necessarily. In other news, players have highlighted that Bungie actually didn't get any nominations for Destiny 2. Based on the year we've had, that's not massively surprising, is it? There we go, give me your thoughts down below. Let me know if you're still interested in partaking in Call to Arms through the week. If you found the video helpful or interesting, maybe, drop us a rating and get subscribed for more Destiny content. Otherwise, thanks for tuning in, and I hope you have an awesome day.